Hi everyone, I'm Eric Vanderwall, and I'm here to give a talk on web accessibility today. And I just want to introduce myself a little bit for some context, which I think will help shape this quick talk a little bit better. Now, I've been in web development for 21 years this year, and I've sort of gone through the process of starting with HTML and then CSS, later came out, and JavaScript was, around. And then I moved on to using content management, starting with Drupal 4, 5, 6, 7. And I didn't really make it to 8. At that point, I moved over mostly to Backdrop. So throughout this lecture, I'm going to use Backdrop in the second half to show my work as we go along. But in the first half, we're just going to talk about a couple of different things, some basic concepts and stuff. Now, during my 21 years of web development, I've been off and on busy, depending on what year it was. And during that period, I also went to university for, I think, 11 years. And I studied to become a doctor of Chinese medicine. And then I did a master's of medicine in andrology, which is men's health. So I have a lot of, contracts and work and that sort of connections within that community as well. So those are definitely my people, as well as developers, of course. And that's what sort of brought this lecture on, or how I got interested in accessibility. And I did do some accessibility in the past, but I never really took it that seriously until more recently. What is web accessibility? Well, web accessibility is giving access or easier access to websites for people that are suffering from disabilities, either permanent or temporary or situational. And some of these disabilities may be including auditory, cognitive, neurological, physical, speech, or visual. And these disabilities don't necessarily need to be lifetime disabilities that people may suffer for their whole life. They could be situational or temporary. So we need to sort of open our mind as to what we consider to be disabilities, because we're not necessarily looking for the legal definition, but we're looking to increase accessibility to everyone. Now, if we are looking at more permanent or temporary disabilities in the entire world, we're looking at over 1 billion people. So that's something like 15% of the world's population. And this can be even higher in developing countries. But looking at America, and I believe it's around up to 20%. So I've seen quoted between 18, 20%, and sometimes a bit lower. But that's, a pretty large number of people that may be affected by web accessibility. And we'll talk about that more soon. I originally came to this topic of accessibility through the ADA, which is the Americans with Disability Act. And this act came into play in 1990. And the ADA is a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination based on disability. So this is a US specific law. However, most countries, or many countries around the world, do have various disability laws of various strengths. But that being said, you probably should be aware of what they are in your own country, especially if you're running any kind of business. Now, we want to talk about ADA compliance, and specifically the Disability Act standards for accessible design, which talks about that all electronic or information technology, such as websites, must be accessible to people with disabilities. And I believe this came out in around 2010. So strictly speaking, it's not that old. And these standards require that companies offer and maintain sites that people with disabilities can use and access. Now, the basis of what makes up the ADA compliance is something called WCAG or WCAG, depending on who's going to pronounce it, but it's WCAG. And we'll look at that at the next slide. But let's first just talk about the ADA compliance a little bit before we get there. Now, the ADA compliance has been out for a bunch of years, but one of the problems with it is that it does not necessarily have clear guidelines on what is ADA compliance in the law. Now, the spirit of the law generally in court cases that I've seen and I've heard and has been referenced, relates back to these WCAG standards. However, when it comes to ADA compliance and you try and check the law, it's not super clear. There are no set standards. The best thing that's out there is what they're calling an ADA website compliance toolkit, and I will have a link to that in the references. But when you look through it, you'll find it's pretty short, and it gives some examples of things you could do, but it's not a legally binding document. It's not the law, it's just suggestions that they're pointing out. Now, again, I'm not a lawyer. I'm just going over, cases that have been in the past and what is, the general current community standard of what people are doing. So this is sort of a tricky part of dealing with ADA compliance because it's not super clear. Okay. In addition to ADA compliance, the US has something called 508 compliance. And this is a little bit different, but similar. So 508 compliance means it's a law that requires federal government websites. And I don't know about state, I guess state to state is probably different, but it requires federal government websites to be safe and accessible for people with disabilities. Okay, it's a little bit different, but it's very tangentially related. I don't work on federal government websites, so it has not been an issue for me. Let's talk about WCAG, or WCAG. I've heard it pronounced different ways, and I'm not comfortable pronouncing them any of the ways. So this stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And this was created by the W3C, which is the World Wide Web Consortium. You may have heard of them if you're a developer. They, put out the guidelines that we use. And they created a special group called WAI, which is WAI, the Web Accessibility Initiative. And they came up with these Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And they first came out in 1999, which is, way back when in web development land. And they were only about HTML because that was sort of what was being used at the time. And if you're a web developer back then, you probably, remember things like GeoCities and flashing banners and, blink tags and, rulers, HR, tags and things like that. And thankfully, we've sort of come a long way from them. And because of that, they put out a version in 2008, which again, in web development land is already quite a while ago. But there was a major difference between version 1 and version 2, and that was that version 2 was more technology agnostic, meaning it wasn't just about HTML now or about a specific technology, but rather a set of, let's say, success criteria that were written as testable statements for us to test our technology as to whether it was accessible or not. So these are not technology specific. I wanted to stop here for a moment before we keep talking about the different WCAG standards, because the WCAG 2.0 standards are still in play today. And they were really broken up into 4 categories of standards that we need to understand. These are the overarching guidelines, the spirit of them. And they're perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So let's just give a couple of examples that maybe can help us understand this better. So if our website is perceivable, we need to have alt tags, and we need to have perhaps print that can be resizable or that's large enough. If it's operable, it needs to be functional from a keyboard, and it doesn't trigger or cause any illnesses such as seizures. as operable as possible. It needs to be as understandable as possible. So our content and structure, like our menu and our pages, should be consistent and helpful. Forms should, have proper labels that, say what or how they're to be used. And we'll go over these things. And then number 4 is robust. So it needs to have the maximum compatibility. We want it to work with as wide variety as technology as possible. So this is the overarching guidelines, and we're going to get into some actual examples soon. So more recently, we've had the WCAG 2.1 standards come out, and instead of this being a replacement for 2.0, 2.1 just adds on some extra recommendations since 2.0 came out in 2008, and that's been quite a while. So 2.1 focuses on a little bit of more future accessibility and different sort of devices or ways that we interact with electronic technology than we did in 2008. And a lot of it has to do with sort of like mobile and maybe screen sizes and rotations and things that we didn't really need to think about at that time. So the success criteria for WCAG, I should point out right away, is separated into 3 separate levels of compliance. There's A, AA, and AAA. Okay. So most websites that need to be ADA compliant, or pretty much all websites that need to be ADA compliant, are shooting for WCAG AA compliance of 2.0. However, when we're working on things, we should keep 2.1 in mind because that's really what's going to help people the most. We do not need to have AAA standard compliance, which is very, very specific. It's harder to meet, and it may not apply to most websites, so that's not something we need to do. Single A compliance, honestly, I don't know who does single A compliance. If you're going to go for single A, you might as well do a little bit better of a job and go for AA compliance. Why do we care? Well, the most obvious answer is to be inclusive of our fellow man and woman, to not be ableist about this, and to focus on people over profits. However, that may not be the best selling pitch to certain businesses, as they're more concerned with said profit over people. But the good thing about working with accessibility is a small investment now can be a bigger turnout profitability wise for later. Of course, the first one is avoiding lawsuits, which is a primary motivator for most businesses and not really accessibility. And we can talk about soon, I think the next slide or a slide after that, who needs to be ADA accessible in the US. And it's not necessarily every website actually, but a large amount of our clients, if you're a web developer or if you are the client, you should be aware, of course, if you need to be ADA compliant. Even if you aren't, accessibility on your website is a good thing. Now, if our websites or your websites are accessibility compliant, it actually increases the usability for everyone. And we're going to see that in the examples. And what that means is that if it's easier for everyone to use, they're going to use your website more. They're going to stay on your website longer. They're going to end up buying more or come back more often, or not just bounce to another website that is potentially harder to use because yours is easier to use. And actually, there's been some studies about this. One was done by ClickAway Pound, which you can find on the internet, called ClickAway Pound. Pound is in UK's currency. And they did a survey in 2016 and found that 4 million people abandoned retail websites because of accessibility barriers. And they estimated that was around 11 billion pounds worth of lost sales. Now, I'm a little sad to say they did the same study in 2016 and found that it actually had grown to over 17 billion pounds of lost sales. So that was actually not an improvement from 2016 to 2019, which is a little bit sad. Now, if more companies focused on having good accessibility, hopefully they'd be able to capture some of that market, because when people can't use your websites, as we know as developers, they're just going to move on to the next website that hopefully is easier for them to use. Now, the last reason, and another great reason to worry or concern yourself with accessibility, is accessibility in almost all circumstances increases your SEO. And again, this is a really good business reason to be concerned about your website's accessibility. I'm not aware of anything that is web accessibility wise that worsens your SEO. And almost everything increases it. I thought I'd do a little FAQ here just before we get into some of the practical stuff to try and be as clear as we can be, but this tends to get a little bit fuzzy here. Okay. So number one, who needs to be ADA compliant in the US? And I should state here that I am Canadian and I'm living in China, which is why this is a recorded lecture, not live. I didn't know how well my internet would hold out. But a lot of my clientele is, in fact, American. They represent a very large part of the market. And so who needs to be ADA compliant? Well, there are three specific groups in general that need to be ADA compliant. And the first is state or local government agencies may be under ADA compliance, where we talked before about federal is typically under the 508. However, these, generally speaking, or completely speaking, have not been my clients in the past, so I'm not as familiar with this. Now, the second main group is private employers with 15 or more employees, and they operate more than 20 hours a week. So that makes up a lot of businesses in the US who need to be ADA compliant. And it probably will take you about 15 minutes max to go to Google and Google around to some companies that you know, and you could find that their websites are not accessibility compliant at all, and they definitely have more than 15 employees. So if you're a developer, this is a pretty big market of people that you could not only help to increase their business potentially, help them prevent a lawsuit, but also help their website be more accessible to more people. Okay, the last group here is one that seems to be getting caught in the squeeze at the moment, which is businesses that operate for the benefit of the public. And this is a little vague, but the interpretation is, generally speaking, we're talking about hotels, transportation services like Uber or any kind of car rental or anything, limo services. If you are medical or allied medical professionals, are also operating for the benefit of the public. Now, the reason I say these are getting a squeeze is that over the last couple of years, the amount of lawsuits against these businesses have been increasing on the rise, or rising. I guess you can't increase on the rise. And it tends to be, at least from the news reports, groups of, lawyers, or a couple lawyers and a couple clients that have been suing many businesses. Like there was one case of them suing over 100 different businesses in California because they could collect damages on suing these businesses. So these were sort of opportunity lawsuits. Therefore, a lot of businesses, for better or worse, are trying to get their sites to be ADA compliant. Now, what is exactly, number 2 FAQ here, what is the connection between the ADA law and WCAG? Well, legally speaking, from my understanding, there is none on paper. As we mentioned, the ADA law itself, ADA compliance law, is not clear about what constitutes ADA compliance other than sort of their suggestion checklist. However, in lots of lawsuits that I am aware of, and you can do your own sort of searches online or talk to, an ADA compliance lawyer, they pretty much always reference back this WCAG guidelines, which, hopefully in the future actually will become the law, just to make things a heck of a lot more clear. Now, I'm not sure of them referencing WCAG 2.1, but more 2.0 AAAA. So in order to be safe compliance-wise, this is what you want to be shooting for. 3 of this FAQ, what is the ADA certificate or WCAG certificate? There is none. There is no unified certificate out there that, a lot of companies will offer you a certificate, and that's fine. Those are their sort of in-house certificates, but that is not a third-party recognized certificate. And the only exception to that is the WCAG certificate. There is a standard certificate that any developer or anyone can go online and fill out all the details of their compliance and then print out or have on their website linked to show that they have gone through the steps. But again, this is not necessarily a legally binding thing. It's a self-reporting thing. And lastly, can you stop me, the client, from getting sued? Well, unfortunately, the answer to this is no. We can't stop anyone from being sued, potentially in the US. The case may be thrown out. The client may win the case, of course, but we can't guarantee that a client won't be sued, or, someone attempting to sue them, may or may not be successful. So this is not something that we can promise people. What we can do, though, is bring them up to these WCAG standards, which will give them the best defense possible while helping lots of people and potentially increasing their business at the same time. Now, there's an FAQ 5 that I want to talk about. I know you're getting bored of this slide, but I don't want to forget about it. And if you go to Google and you search WCAG compliance, you're going to get some advertising for some various plugins or assets, whatever you want to call them, for like WordPress, and there's some for Drupal and some other content management systems. And you click into them and they're going to say, install this overlay, install this tool. It's going to make you 100% WCAG, compliant, guaranteed, blah, 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 blah. Well, unfortunately, after reviewing a bunch of websites that are using it, I found that they are not compliant. Perhaps they've disabled part of it. I don't know. Perhaps the tool was not really that well developed, but it does not take long to find giant holes in it because so much of this is context specific. There is no plugin that can figure out the context of how humans interpret things to be 100% compliant. And, they could probably help out with certain things, but as developers, we have a much better chance of, being able to be compliant than any kind of plugin. And to me, these are a big scam. They're charging anywhere from like $50 and up a month. And after a year or two, you could have just paid a professional to help you do things right the first time instead of using a tool that unfortunately just doesn't get you there. And there have been cases of these people being sued, large companies being sued who were using these tools, and they weren't compliant. And as a client, you cannot hide behind, well, I used this tool and they told me I would be compliant. Unfortunately, that is not a legal defense, or it wasn't in this case, is because they were found guilty and had to pay quite a bit in compensation. Okay, in this second part, we're going to look at some hopefully somewhat practical examples, and I've got a mock website up here that I like to use as my sandbox. And I am running Backdrop here, and I'm using a Bootstrap theme. And some of the things are done okay on this website, and some of the things are done not okay, so we can go ahead and have a look. And for the most part, it more or less looks okay. When we look at it straight off the bat, it looks like a website, it looks functioning. We have links and testimonials and whatever else. But we're going to go through it section by section and try and cover sort of the major parts of WCAG. We cannot cover all of it in 1 hour, no matter how hard we try, but we can try the largest, some of the most important things, and hopefully I can pique your interest in digging in a little bit further into this. Because if we build this right from the beginning, that is super helpful. We're going to save ourselves so much time down the road. If we need to go and adjust it, it's not all that bad, especially if we don't have hundreds of pages to go over. And the first thing I want to talk about is links, because this is one that most websites that are looking to be web accessible suffer problems of. And I'm going to give you some handouts to download later so you can look at the exact, exactly what I'm reading off, because you're looking at my screen here, so you may not necessarily be able to pay attention to what I've written. But under WCAG 2.0, and this is level A, it says use of color. This is 1.4.1. So again, we can check this later, but it says color is not used as the only visual means of conveying information, indicating an action, prompt a response, or distinguishing a visual element. So what does this mean? This means we cannot use links only with color as the indicator that it's a link. So for example, we have this blog post here, or we have this read more link. And the only thing that's really indicating this is link is the difference in color. And even here, it's quite subtle. So this is, difficult to see. Now, what's the solution to this? The solution to this is what pretty much all default web browsers go to, which is putting an underline under links. And I know some people are sort of hesitant to this because they think, oh, underlines make things look ugly. But the truth is that underlines make links extremely easy to see and make them accessible. Because if you could not see color, you would not be able to know that this is potentially a link. Okay, so let me just break it down for you. Add underlines to your links, okay? This is how you're going to be accessible. Now, there are some exceptions to this. What are the exceptions? The exceptions to this are your main menu, because we know that menus are typically links. The other exception to this is buttons. However, this is still not great on showing that it's a link necessarily. So I'm going to make a quick adjustment to this, and then we'll come right back to see how it looks. And here it is in my CSS injector. So this is a module I've installed under configuration, under development, CSS injector, and then I'm going to add a new rule and just call it accessibility. You can call it whatever you want. We'll put it in there. I'm going to apply it to every page. Save. Now you may need to flush your cache if you're using Drupal or Drupal related technology here, and it will apply. Now, the next rule we want to look at is the idea of link in purpose. So this is also WCAG 2.0, and this is also a single A, meaning this is absolutely, bottom of the barrel you need to have. It's link in purpose in context. And what this is the purpose of each link can be determined from the link text alone, or from the link text together with a programmatically determined link context. So that's like a mouthful for me. But what it means is, in short, you need to identify your links as to what they are, the purpose of the link in context. So for example, this learn more link in the context of the link itself means nothing. If my screen reader comes over to learn more to read it, it does not tell me where that link goes, what it does, or what it means. So what we want to do is put in the link itself where it goes, okay? So in this case, I'm just going to configure this block, and we're going to change the text of this link to say What does it do? Where does it go? Okay, so I've just changed to say about Andrology, and we can update this block and save it. And this alone, even though it's a very small change, gives context to where this link is or what it does. So it's going to go to a page about Andrology. So we can look at through some of these other ones. View services is okay for me. It's going to go to the services page, the view the portfolio, view details. Well, that one's a little bit not great. There's not enough context information here. But here's a big one that we get to, and I'm sorry this is like popping back and forth. It's something we're going to fix in a minute. But these ones all say read more, read more, read more, read more. And this is a hugely common problem with like WordPress, Drupal, or any other sort of content management system that automatically generates these, so-called read more links. And thankfully, using Backdrop, we can adjust the views to make these a little bit better. So let's go ahead and adjust the view to see what we can do. So let's configure the view. Keeping in the spirit with links, the next thing we should really be thinking about is keyboard navigation. Not all systems are using mouse navigation for quite a few different reasons, and therefore we need to be able to move around our content using keyboards. Whether we're just pushing the up and down key to go and up and down on the pages, that should be fairly self-evident. The other thing is we should be able to move just in up and down or left and right, depending on the website. And you can see this site actually has a left and right issue here due to this slider down here, which we will fix. But the one that really tends to get people is the tab key. If you didn't already know, you can click tab to navigate through a website from link to link to link and push enter to enter that link. Now, using this keyboard, you should be able to see what element is being selected or being focused on with this tab. So if I push Shift Tab, it's going to go back. We can see Gallery, Blog, FAQ, Services, Home, TCM Andrology, and so on and so forth. Now, this actually is looking not too bad, but we need to tab through everything to see what's being selected here. And we can see about TCM Andrology, and it'll jump down. Okay, now once we get to our image gallery, we've got issues here. We can't see what's being selected. And if we hover over with our mouse, we can see there are actually links here to these images. And this is an accessibility issue. So let's keep tabbing down. And we should eventually reach the portfolio view details. So again, here with the slider, we're having some issues. But once we reach the blog, we appear to be okay. And this will bring us into the form at the bottom. Okay. So when you're testing websites, you need to test using a keyboard. You're going to use tab to try and go through all of it and see that everything is selected. So if not, we can use the focus to help us select it with CSS and give it an example. So I'll just show you a little example here. We'll jump back over to the CSS injector and edit an accessibility rule. And I'm just going to copy and paste an example in here. So it should be something like this. We're going to have A, and we're going to use a pseudo selector of focus, and we can give it an outline, for example, of 2 pixels, and maybe it's going to be solid orange, just as an example. In fact, what we can do is if you are using Chrome, here's a little trick. If you don't already know, you can go inspect and we should be inspecting this element. And if we click a little hover here, as you can see, it's hard to see the focus when we are, having this open here, our inspector. So we can just click focus, and it's going to show us how it looks when it's focused, or focus within, active or inactive, hover or unhover, and this will help us to see easier what's focused or not focused, because you won't find it here in the CSS until you hit focus, and then it's going to add here what we're doing with the focus. And you can see it here. We have a focus, and this is actually comes from Bootstrap by itself, and we can adjust the offset of this to be larger or smaller, different colors to make it easier to be more accessible depending on your design. So you should definitely tab through everything and make sure that it's all looking correct. Okay, I'm going to close this up. And as we noticed before, if we're tabbing through things, it's actually going to bring us down to this form. Now, there's a bunch of different rules when it comes to forms, but of course, one of the most important things is that we can see that we are focused on the form when our tab is in it. You can see that I have a blue color change here, and it highlights out. Now, per the earlier rules, we can't only use color to indicate a change of focus or a link or any other thing. So even though this is blue, and that helps some people, it's nice to have sort of, I believe this is a shadow effect, to see that it is in fact selected here. Now, when it comes to these forms, we can see our focus, which is good. But the next thing we need to talk about is labels or instructions. And again, this is just level A stuff. It's not even, double A. And it says labels or instructions are provided when content requires user input. Okay, well, this requires user input. And it says name, and it says subject and email. And so we have sort of a basic label. But the intent here is to give enough information to fill in the form and not just label the form without being unnecessarily cluttering the page. So we don't want too much information, but we need more than this, okay? So I'm going to edit this quickly and see what we can do better. And this is the changes I've made. So we've changed name to full name so they know that we're looking for the full name. And I've added the words required. So when a screen reader reads this, it's going to read full name required. Because this little asterisk here, we hover it over, it says this field is required, may not be read by the screen reader. This may not be screen reader compliant. So we have subject required, email required, and message required. If it, for example, had the date or maybe an expiration date because it's a credit card, it should say something like expiration date and then have an example of how it looks. So it should say something like this: expiration date, month, / year, y, and then say required. We need to have these labels as clear as they can be, with as much information as necessary without being overly cluttered. So this is something to keep in mind when dealing with labels on forms, which are pretty much on most websites these days to contact people. So I think we're about halfway through here of these practical examples, and this is another one that is actually fairly easy and that should be common sense now once we're thinking about screen readers and tabbing through content and everything else. But it may not be immediately apparent that this actually is an image. It's not text. And therefore, screen readers cannot read this. We cannot, if we are just resizing text, then it won't resize well. So this is a zoom, so it's not actually just text. But if we want to increase line height, for example, here, it won't increase the line height because it's an image. We can't increase or decrease the contrast using a special browser plugin because it's an image. So this needs to be replaced with actual HTML and CSS. So no text as images, just don't do it. The only place that this is considered to be exempt is the logo. And actually my logo here is just text anyways. Up next is clean code. Of course, we want to use as much clean code as possible because any errors in code can be difficult for screen readers to read. But we also need to make sure that we are using semantic correct semantic structure, which means that we are using H1 tags properly. And, we have our header in here or whatever our title is. Okay. And then we move to H2 and 3 and so on and so forth, because this is how screen readers know how to organize the information. Right? And of course we can have, H2, H3 like this, but we could also have an H3 within this. Well, this would have to be an H2 under there, but we could have an H3 within this section like this. And that would be perfectly acceptable. It would still be in semantic structure. That brings on to the fact that we should not be, and I see this all the time, we should not have any empty header tags. And I see them being used as spaces. And I think it's, automated systems where, that what you see is what you get systems, and they'll often go like this. And this is a big no-no, of course. The next thing when we're dealing with header tags and other tags is this should not be used for design purposes, okay? Just because we want some text to be extra large doesn't mean we should throw an H1 tag on there. It needs to be in the correct semantic structure. And we're going to do a little bit of automated tested at the ending, and this will show you how we can catch some of these things without going through, the entire website, because when we're using content management systems, we're dealing with a lot of different blocks or whatever you want to call them. And it can be like very time consuming to try and open them all up and like check, right? Or like to necessarily browse the code directly. It can be difficult to see if things are semantically correct. So we'll use an automated testing tool at the end to do that. Moving along, websites should have skip links, and if you're a web developer, you may already be familiar with skip links. I'm going to open up a new copy of this website in Cognito mode, so I'm not logged in. Okay, here we are in incognito mode, and I'm going to go ahead and just hit tab. And the first thing the tab should bring you to is skip to main content. Now, you don't necessarily need to have this skip link visible until it's selected, but what it should do is skip over your menu and automatically select you into the main content. And on my front page, it could be the header, because the header contains information that people should be reading that's not necessarily navigation. Depending on your setup, it may be down here, but normally it's linked to the main section of your website using HTML5, which is main. Okay, now this skip to main content link is not good because it's really not that visible when it's selected. It should have a different colored background and such, but if we hit enter, it has jumped us down. Or when I hit tab, the first thing it's going to bring us is to About Andrology. So it is working, but it does need to be styled differently. So don't forget those. Skip to content. Now if I back up, it may, oh, there we go. It was selected correctly. So skip to main content. If you're using a backdrop, you might find that it doesn't work when you have the admin bar on. So go ahead and open up an incognito version of your website that you're working on, and you're going to be able to test it out much easier. The next one was annoying me to no end, and I set it up here on purpose, but it just continued to annoy me so much that I had to stop it, which is the testimonials. Now, if you have any kind of animation or movement on your website, it needs to be pausable. The user needs to be able to pause it. They need to be able to control it. And it should not be changing more than, I believe, 3 times per... Oh no, I'm gonna have to check now. Is it 3 times per minute? Okay, so sometimes you're gonna need to Google these things if you can't remember the exact thing, and you're gonna find them on the, I have the w3.org here, and they are saying 3 flashes or less per second, and this is often considered actually 3 animations per less in most cases, because these animations, if they keep going by quite fast, they could potentially cause seizures for people, as it's not that different than a flash actually. Now, also animations, and this is under carousals, it must have a play or stop button to resume animations. Okay, now this carousal does not actually come with a play or stop button, and if I put the mouse over it, it in fact can pause, and that's here, but I don't believe that is actually sufficient. This is especially true if you're trying to use a screen reader, okay, because you may not be able to put your mouse over something in order to pause it, therefore it needs a button to pause it. And that can be actually really difficult to deal with as a web designer unless you're using some kind of JavaScript or something else. So in my case, I actually often choose just not to use any animations on websites that need to be website accessibility compliant. And if you do choose to, then you need to go to these pages in the w3.org information under website accessibility tutorials, and look very carefully about how the rules are of doing this and about hiding the transition elements and other things like this. Now, I actually don't mind having a slider, a carousel here, but these buttons here definitely need to be larger so they're easier to see and click, and they need to be easier to view when they are selected by the menu, such as keyboard, such as using tabs, because they can be changed, which is good, that's compliant, but they really have a real lack of contrast and size, which make them difficult to see. Okay, and now we're down to our very last 2 things before we look at automated testing, and I'm probably way over an hour now. I haven't even checked, but I'll try and wrap this up quick. Now, images and alt tags. As developers, you're very aware of alt tags, going back to the days of keyword stuffing alt tags, which is probably one of the largest piss-offs I've heard from people using screen readers, was when you stuff something, and maybe this is a picture of a bag, and you've got a shopping website, and people will put in the word like bag, comma, satchel, comma, backpack, comma, leather. And so when people are using screen readers, it's just going to say all these words out. And it's just like, okay, I'm done with this. It's horrible. But we do need to give alt tags to images. All images, except for potentially some of these background images that are placed with CSS, need alt tags because the screen reader won't read this. And we can break up all of our images into 2 categories. We have ones that are decorative and ones that are, informational or functional. So, for example, these images here are purely decorational. They have no actual function necessarily. They're simply there to look pretty. So if someone's using a screen reader and they're not set as to what these are, it really makes no difference. It doesn't add any information to this website. And how we need to deal with this is we still can't skip an alt tag. Okay, we need to tell the screen reader that yes, in fact, we know that it's there, but we don't want to say anything about it. Okay, so in this here, we have like welcome to my blog. So it's using the title, and that's annoying because we already have the title. So they don't want to hear the title again after or before just hearing the title. They're going to hear it over and over again. So what we're going to do is actually delete this, and we're going to have an empty alt tag. And I see that Chrome does not like that, okay? So when you do it in your actual code, it needs to be alt like this and empty. And a screen reader will then skip over it and know that it's purely a decorative image. Okay, so if you had an image gallery, for example, we may actually need to add alt tags to this because this is informational. The point is the image gallery, and therefore it does need alt tags. Okay. Now, sometimes it's hard to know if something is informational or purely decorative. So for example, in this biography image, and in these cases, I tend to err on the side of caution and add the information. Okay, so I would add the person's name and say like biography photo of this person, you know, on gray background or something like that. And of course, having good alt tags with good descriptions is good for our SEO. I mean, it's not going to change things, tip the scale crazily, but not having them potentially can hurt us more than having proper alt tags. So this is a good way to do it. So I think alt tags is fairly simple, but something that a lot of websites, you know, miss, and we should be very aware that we're doing that properly. Okay, this is the last one we want to talk about here before we look at some automated testing. But this is understanding the success criteria of contrast. And this is where it is in the guidelines. And I probably should have been pulling up these pages from the very beginning. I'm sorry about that, but it's probably easier to see this way. But for a level of AA compliance here, we need a minimum contrast ratio of 4.1 to 1, except for large scale text, which only needs 3.1. Okay, here's the thing though. Pretty much make everything at least 4.5 to 1 contrast unless you have a very specific reason not to. Okay, this doesn't count for text that's part of a logo or brand name has no contrast requirements, or if something is purely decorational and that it has no necessary function. However, that being said, always err on the side of caution of going 4.5 to 1 in contrast. Now you're probably saying, what is 4.1 to 5 in contrast? And thankfully Google with Chrome has made this easier for us to figure out. I'm going to just double click on this, right click and choose inspect. And we're going to drag this all the way over here again. And we're going to look at our styles. And if we choose the color of this text here, or whatever color we want to look at, we can click on the color picker, and it's going to bring up the color picker, and we can see right here, it says the contrast ratio, and it's always measured to 1, is basically 5 to 1. So it's giving us a little checkbox saying, yes, this in fact has a successful contrast ratio. It's good. So if we move this up, we can quickly see that this does not have enough contrast ratio. And without testing this in some sort of automated fashion like this, it's very difficult to know. You can't necessarily trust your eyes on this one. So if we click down here to say show more, we can see the 888 requires 7.0. Now, on a lot of websites that I work on, I actually do use 7.0 because it is much easier to see. You know, if you're outside with your phone and you're looking at it and sun shining outside, you can see that 7.0 a heck of a lot easier than you can see, you know, 4.5 to 1. And these lines here represent staying within this. So anything below this line is a 4.5, anything below this line is a 7. So we can easily just select here and remove down the contrast scale to know what we need. Now, when we're doing this, you know, Google Chrome automatically picks up that our background is white. But if we go up to, for example, here, it may not be able to pick up the background image because it's placed with CSS and we have a bunch of different colors. It does get a little more difficult to understand. So let's inspect this, and things are fonts white, and it says no contrast information, okay? And how we could more easily do this, I'm just going to pick another place, and we are going to say we're using white. Okay, it's going to say it's failing because we're looking down here. But if we drop this down open, we can use this to toggle between the background and foreground color. So I'll click this, then click my little picker and say, okay, this is the background color. It's acceptable as AA, but not quite as AAA. For the very last part here, I want to look at some automated testing solutions because these are going to help us to, speed up our process. Okay, that being said, no automated testing solution can help us pick up all of the issues. These are just going to help around an estimated 30 to 40% of the things can be picked up, but still that is helpful for us nevertheless. Okay, one is a plugin called Wave here, and I've already installed it. And Wave comes for both Firefox and Google, or for Chrome. And you can see it quickly picks out a lot of the issues and errors. And we can go to the details to see what they are. So it's telling us there's missing alternative text here for different things. So for example, this is missing the alternative text. And if we hit this little code thing down here, it should, in theory, when we click on it, tell us specifically which block. So this block here has no alt text. It can tell us which forms are missing labels, such as the search menu here, which actually is just part of the menu bar for backdrop. So you probably want to disable this because it's going to give you extra errors. So we have lots of empty links. These links actually aren't going anywhere. And we have a ton of low contrast errors. And it's just saying these are very low contrast. And if we actually hit contrast here, it will tell us what we're at. So it's saying this is a 3.7, 3 to 1 contrast ratio. And we could just adjust this here to see, what's going to be good, and we can copy this foreground color and fix it, and that would help us out right away. So we could use this tool instead of Google Chrome's tool. Now if you pick something and you hit the reference, it normally, here, I'll hit here, it will tell us why this matters. So this is a very helpful tool. So this is the Wave tool that you can go ahead and install. Now the other one that we can use is built directly into Chrome, and again we just open the inspection tool here, and it can be a little hard to see here. We have to hit this and choose Lighthouse, and Lighthouse can generate reports for us. We want specifically the accessibility report here, and we're going to click Generate Report, and it's going to give us a number for our report and say it's like this, good or bad. In general, as well as pick out the issues. And you're going to find some differences between the Wave and Lighthouse as they pick up slightly different things. Again, because there's no necessary one way to do this. And at 69, it's really not a great score here. And it tells you which elements are failing. And you could see here the background and foreground don't have enough contrast. So again, it says this is failing, but it may not necessarily be because it may not pick up the CSS background. So this is, again, something that a human needs to know and to check to see what is or isn't failing. We could also just take a look at this on what it's going to look like on mobile. And again, so this is not looking particularly great here. There's definitely some issues that need to be resolved. Okay, so we really burned through a lot of different things pretty fast, and you would be surprised how much of the WCAG this actually covers. This covers a large amount of things, and it often comes down to a smaller amount of semantics of applying it properly to get it done. Now, two major things I didn't cover in here, but I just want to throw out there because it is something that comes up on a lot of websites, is one is documents that are linked to your website should be accessibility compliant themselves. And typically PDFs are not accessibility compliant. Okay, if you go to Google and search, there are tons of different tutorials about how to make accessibility compliant documents using Word, which is a great way to do it. The other major thing that I didn't cover here is media, that is audio or video media that has very special needs to meet. For example, video media needs an audio description as well as typically transcripts. And those transcripts need to include not only exactly the words that are being said, so not like closed captions, but also to say what's happening. And if websites don't have those, then of course, things are going to be much simpler. If they do have them, then there's going to be definitely more work involved. So I just wanted to throw those out there. I'm going to attach this XML checklist that I use. Now, this is just a plain language checklist that I came up with here, and you can see the reference of where it came from. So you can actually check all of the WCAG 2.0 A to AAA compliance here with this. And these are the things that I just typically check over for everything. So, we have meaningful alt tags, we have clear structures, the content is a meaningful order. We don't rely on solely sensory characteristics such as sounds, colors. So for example, links have to be underlined. Media doesn't play automatically. Okay, so this is all single A. This is all double A, and I haven't added any triple A. All of the X are the ones that I don't typically do, such as documents necessarily, transcripts, and that sort of stuff. So I really encourage you to go ahead and go to the website and read over this appendix here and read over details and get more educated with using, or setting up web accessibility with the websites you're designing, especially from the beginning, because it will make things so much easier if you have large websites to just apply it from the very beginning. If you guys have any comments or questions and concerns, go ahead. If you're watching this live, go ahead and chat. Add that into the chat. If not, you can feel free to email me, and I will add that to the attachments for this as well. Everyone, take care.